As a libertarian, I naturally see a lot of libertarian content on social media. A pretty common trope of libertarian populists in the post-COVID era is sharing an article, without comment, from some mainstream news source lamenting the spread of misinformation. The implied punchline is that the elites are once again conspiring to fearmonger about people thinking for themselves. And since the elite got so much wrong about COVID, while the so-called conspiracy theorists got everything right, we can feel pretty comfortable just ignoring the specialists and consulting Alex Jones or Dr. Google. The real question here is whether specialists in their fields are more or less trustworthy than skeptical freethinkers who have no degrees or expertise, but think they have more common sense than the ivory tower snobs in the government medical complex. As you might have guessed, I'm skeptical of the claim that a non-expert is generally more trustworthy than an expert in a given field. And here's the thing, you are too. If you're having computer issues and you know someone who specializes in computers, you'll talk to them before you talk to your great-grandfather who's never used a computer in his life. Or if you're having car trouble, you're not going to consult your Joe Biden-loving, Whole Foods shopping, women's studies majoring niece. You're going to talk to your MAGA mechanic cousin. However, even though COVID skeptics confidently held to a lot of stupid ideas, like your uncle who called it a psyop and then ended up dying while hooked up to a ventilator, the skeptics ended up being right about some things, despite having almost no specialized knowledge, or even much in the way of good evidence to help them reach their conclusions. So how is it possible that your, One America News Network watching grandpa who types in all caps and think, Hitler got a bad rap, got some important things right while elites, specialists, experts got them very wrong? Here are a few reasons why experts can be off base. First, they naturally trust other experts in their field. This can sometimes create a consensus based on minimal actual evidence. So let's say you're a doctor advising your patients on mask wearing during the height of COVID. You haven't done any direct research yourself, so you have to trust someone else's conclusions. So who are you going to believe? Your specialist colleagues at the CDC who actually know how to study this stuff and kind of understand how it works? Or, some online doofus on disability ranting about how Hillary Clinton is secretly a reptile person from Dimension X. You're going to trust your expert colleagues, of course, right? And usually you'll be right, but not always. Why? Well, that brings us to our next issue. Secondly, experts can bias their conclusions based on non-scientific concerns as opposed to objectively considering the data. In the early days of COVID, when no one really knew for sure where it came from, there were nevertheless good reasons to consider the possibility that it had leaked from a Chinese lab. But if you're a left-leaning, college-educated doctor or scientist, you're not really going to want to shed light on this possibility because it could be manipulatively used by bad-faith, right-wing racists to scare at bigotry, that was the concern at least, or worse yet, help Trump. Instead of being honest and potentially handing a loaded weapon to bad people, you set the science aside and you follow the spirit of the age, which is so concerned about emboldening bigots that it unfortunately makes them look like truth seekers. Thirdly, this brings us to a related social pressure. Humans are more motivated to please their social groups than to pursue the truth wherever it leads. So if Donald Trump is saying that COVID came from China, and you're a specialist with a bunch of left-wing friends and colleagues, are you going to admit that Trump might be right? So partisanship here, warps our incentives. That the left-leaning specialists say to wear masks, so the right-wing populists refuse to do it because the specialists are evil, liberal liars who just want to suffocate us to death. And so we sort of pick our sides in reaction, right? Then when evidence comes forward that maybe the masks aren't as effective as the specialists had hoped, they don't want to acknowledge it because it makes the populists, the people who aren't experts, the Trump-voting morons or whatever, look more competent than they are. But it's not like the populists were appealing to better scientific data in the early months of COVID. They just naysayed every tentative conclusion of the specialists. And sometimes that naysaying ended up being correct, which of course it was at times because we didn't know, right? So that brings us to the last problem for the experts. In science, our conclusions are always tentative. Of course, some conclusions are more tentative than others, like about how best to respond to a brand new strain of a disease that we haven't studied before. But government doesn't want to build policy on early, tentative conclusions. They want to build it on the quote-unquote settled science, trademark. So if you're a politician, you don't want to start shutting down businesses and schools based on conjecture alone. So the experts got some things wrong, and they hurt people in the process with bad policies. Some have admitted as such, but most have either doubled down or quietly memory hold their previous statements. So much for the scientific method, right? So what should we learn from this? First of all, I think we should learn that experts are humans and can make mistakes, but they probably know more than non-experts, so they should be seen as more trustworthy in their areas of specialization, all things considered. Secondly, experts should learn to watch out for biases that can influence their conclusions. They should value the tentative conclusions held by those in their field, but they also need to remember that those tentative conclusions are subject to change. We've had many revolutions in science because, someone with knowledge of the field saw things another way and challenged the consensus. Experts need to make room for these oddballs and outliers to ask questions and make trouble for the status quo. Finally, we should learn that politics almost always makes things worse. We should have been able to have an open conversation about how best to respond to this new disease, but instead we hardened into our positions, whether they were right or wrong, or right or left. We were unable to listen with open minds, and as a result, it took longer to get to the truth. In the end, what should we put our trust in? The educated opinions of elite experts in academia in Washington, D.C., or the common homespun wisdom of regular working people in the heartland? Well, neither. We trust the processes of free speech and open inquiry that have helped us to get closer to the truth despite the roadblocks set up by right-wing and left-wing politics. So if you're consulting a physician, taking your car to a mechanic, or paying someone to fix your PC, presume that they have expertise that you don't. But don't be afraid to ask questions. You'll probably be glad you did.